Hey, what's up, people? This is Movado 242 coming to you again live from undisclosed location, but I'm not in my military bunker this time. So, just in case you wanted to know, I've been reading a book by an author named Donald Jeffries called Hidden History, and it chronicles a whole lot of things, a whole lot of stories that, um, if you just listen to the mainstream version of them, you may not have gotten the full story. And he breaks it down into different chapters and different sections. It's got a section called the 60s that is particularly interesting. It may expose you to some things that you didn't really know about the 60s counterculture movement. So it begins this section called False Opposition, talking about the war in Vietnam. As the war in Vietnam began to escalate in the mid 1960s, organized opposition arose all over the country, while the public would become either enamored with or annoyed by radical leaders of the counterculture movement such as Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, a truly independent researcher. Chicago's Sherman Skolnick began to look seriously into their backgrounds. Skolnick would claim in a later report that high-profile leaders of the movement, such as like Rubin, Hoffman, Tom Hayden, and Rennie Davis, had actually been funded by establishment think tanks like the Carnegie Foundation and Institute for Policy Studies, as well as government agencies like the Office of Economic Opportunity. The notion that the anti-government radicals were being financed by the government was a real eye-opener. However, Skolnick had a limited following, and the mainstream media, as always, steered clear of subjects like this. Another organization supposedly funding radical activities was the Roger Baldwin Foundation, which Skolnick alleged had members sitting on its board of overseers who had connections to the CIA. And if you know anything about history, Stalin had a famous quote that said, the best way to run an opposition is to control both sides of it, paraphrasing. That means you control the for and against. And as you can see, that technique was being placed into high use right here. Skolnick officially charged that Tom Hayden, husband of actress Jane Fonda, was a counterinsurgent posing as a radical revolutionary. He maintained that Hayden had one of the highest security clearances in the country. Skolnick also claimed that Rennie Davis had a publicist that had been an executive with the Public Administration Service in Chicago, labeled by Skolnick as an ultra-right-wing quasi-government organization. He further stated that this publicist was connected to the CIA through the Public Administration Service. The attorney for the Chicago Seven, as Hoffman, Rubin, and others were labeled, was well-known leftist William Kunstler. According to Skolnick, Kunstler had formerly been an officer with the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. And so, what you really thought was a counterculture in the 60s was being run by the government. Plain and simple. We know about COINTELPRO, so this is nothing new. While Kunstler would go on to defend the most objectionable persons imaginable, such as the New York subway killer Colin Ferguson, he didn't seem to like the Kennedys. In a 1976 speech at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Kunstler stated that he was not entirely upset by the Kennedy assassinations, inasmuch as he believed John and Robert Kennedy were two of the most dangerous men in the country. Attempting to downplay the remarks in an interview with People magazine of February 16, 1976, Kunstler revealed that he was on board with the newly burgeoning establishment left's view of Kennedy. What I meant to say was that in retrospect, from what I know about the violent excesses of the Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the foreign assassination plots, the deployment of the first troops in Vietnam, I'm glad they were not around. God knows what would have happened if they had stayed in power. Now, if you look at all three of those incidents he mentioned, the Bay of Pigs, we all know about the Bay of Pigs invasion, who was running that, and that was definitely not Kennedy. As a matter of fact, Kennedy pulled the plug on it, and ended up getting the John Dulles, who was then head of the CIA. He got fired because of that. And so then Dulles ends up running the commission, the Warren Commission on Kennedy assassination. So, he was a very objective leader of that commission. And then we look at foreign assassination plots, deployment of first troops in Vietnam. Yeah, so we can see, we know where his attitude was at. Kunstler's blatant hatred of the Kennedys brings up a curious point about the anti-establishment movement of the 60s. Why didn't any of those radicals talk about the JFK assassination? Why didn't they protest the implausible official findings of the government or question the legitimacy of the Johnson presidency in light of that? Surely a genuine anti-war movement ought to question the death of the most peace-loving president in the modern era, a death that was precipitated by the escalation of the war they were supposed to be protesting. There was the Shakespearean parody MacBird, but although it accused a thinly disguised LBJ of complicity in the assassination, it painted a picture of both JFK and his brother Robert that was hardly flattering. In a 2006 Washington Post interview, MacBird author Barbara Garson asked if she thought Johnson had been responsible for JFK's death. Pragmatically stated, "I never took that seriously. I used to say to people, if he did it, it's the least of his crimes. It was not what the play was about. The plot was a given." Now, won't go too far into the Kennedy assassination, but if you should go on YouTube and look up some interviews by the Jim Garrison, who was the Attorney General of Louisiana at the time. He and back in those days, if you had an opposition person on, you had to have someone from the other side speak. So ABC or NBC, one of them came out with a story on rebutting his report, and they had to give him equal airtime to voice his case. And he makes a strong argument. So that's Jim Garrison. He was the actually he was on. That was an episode of him on the Johnny Carson show, and you can just see Johnny Carson trying to steer him away from the truth. It's pretty well. It's not funny, but it's funny the way it happened. Look that up on that YouTube video up of Jim Garrison. And as we move on into the 60s, something that really surprised me too here that I read in this book. Let's talk about McGeorge Bundy. McGeorge Bundy had been JFK's national security advisor, and he played the same role in the Johnson administration. Bundy has long been suspect in many critics' eyes. As noted earlier, he drafted NSAM 273, which contradicted JFK's express policy in Vietnam the day before the assassination. On November 22, 1963, Bundy informed the members of JFK's cabinet who were in the air at the time of the assassination en route to a meeting in Hawaii that it had already been established there was no conspiracy in the shooting of the president. Bundy was communicating with the White House Situation Room only a few hours after the crime had been committed, when very few facts were known and no one could reasonably have been so certain about the situation. And how often have we seen that happen? That minutes after something, hours after an event, we have the narrative. Bin Laden did it. Let's run down the list. Always. There's always, immediately after the event, we know who did it. So they've been running that game for years, man. It's nothing new. Says Bundy left LBJ in 1966 to become president of the Ford Foundation, where his goal was to use their substantial resources to leverage change in America. The Ford Foundation funded radical Mexican nationalist group La Raza, for example. Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas, mentioned elsewhere in these pages, was appalled at this financing, stating that the president of the Mexican American Youth Organization likes to threaten to kill what he terms gringos if all else fails. And that, yeah, we see that today. Man, this is like, this could be the exact same thing is going on now. Theodore Roosevelt's sharp-tongued daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, remarked, "The Ford Foundation's support of provocateurs and revolutionaries throughout the nation is raising numerous eyebrows. The foundation also financed the autobiography of Black Panther Huey Newton. Senator Edward Kennedy showed some understanding of how things work when he lamented the growing use of domestic spies in schools and political groups at public meetings of informants who sometimes help to foment the very acts they are supposed to be investigating." And so they found that Huey P. Newton's autobiography. Interesting. And all the while, we know the FBI had infiltrated the Black Panthers with COINTELPRO. And I think somewhere else in this book I read that two other icons of the 60s, the black revolutionaries, Angela Davis and Stokely Carmichael. I read where they spent a weekend or summer at the Tavistock Institute. And that led me down another rabbit hole that I did some investigation on. And it was an eye-opener as well. Nothing is as it seems. Katrina Van Heuvel, the editor of leftist magazine The Nation, is the daughter of William Vanden Heuvel and a member of the CFR. Williams was a protege of Wild Bill Donovan, founder of the OSS, forerunner to the CIA. He served as a board member of the International Rescue Committee, which was financed by the Ford Foundation and allegedly tied to the CIA. He also served at one time as Robert Kennedy's executive assistant. Veteran anti-war activist Charles Shaw, publisher of Newtopia, has linked him with the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, a devious plan to insert friendly assets into key positions within the media. This project was so successful that former CIA Director William Colby would later state, "The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media." Man, this is some crazy stuff. Aldous Huxley is known today as primarily as the author of the novel Brave New World. He was one of the first prominent Americans to publicly endorse the use of psychedelic drugs. Controversial political theorist Lyndon LaRouche called Huxley the high priest for Britain's Opium War, and later claimed he played a conspicuous role in laying the groundwork for the 60s counterculture. Now, Lyndon LaRouche is an interesting character. It was a document that he wrote that I found out some more information on Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis, that Angela Davis's mentor was a CIA operative, and Stokely Carmichael was knowing or unknowingly being used to further the gains of the intelligence agency. So two of the icons of black revolutionaries of the 60s had connections. And if you try and bring that up in certain circles, you may have to, defend yourself, because people hold they put these icons, these stars, and these celebrities on pedestals, and we start not attacking them, but just bringing out the facts, telling the truth. It seems to rub some people the wrong way. I heard a saying that, a lie is a lie even if everyone believes it. And the truth is the truth whether no one believes it. They don't change. It's just your perception. So as it says, Huxley was a proponent of one of the first prominent Americans to publicly endorse the use of psychedelic drugs. And that's interesting, too, that, I saw an article where these Silicon Valley execs are taking micro doses of LSD to boost creativity. So let's see. The 60s counterculture. Huxley's grandfather was Thomas H. Huxley, founder of the Rhodes Roundtable and a longtime collaborator with the establishment British historian Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee headed the research division of British intelligence during World War II and was a briefing officer to Winston Churchill. Aldous Huxley was tutored at the at Oxford by novelist H.G. Wells, a well-known advocate of world government. Expounding in his Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution, Wells wrote, "The Open Conspiracy will appear first, I believe, as a conscious organization of intelligent and quite possibly in some cases wealthy men as a movement having distinct social and political aims. In all sorts of ways, they will be influencing and controlling the apparatus of the ostensible government." Wells introduced Huxley to the notorious Satanist Aleister Crowley. Sounds like they were talking about deep state. Huxley's brother Julian was a prominent evolutionary biologist and a founding member of the World Wildlife Fund. He also was the first director of UNESCO. Notoriously, he was the president of the British Eugenics Society from 1959 to 1962. And something about the World Wildlife Fund, you may not know, a little fun fact, the World Wrestling Federation had to change their name from the WWF to the WWE because of the World Wildlife Fund. So go figure that. Like the rest of his eugenist peers, Huxley's distaste for the common folk could be found in his public utterances. While in charge of UNESCO, he once said that intelligence testing had determined that only 10 to 20% of the population are capable of profiting by a university course. Like so many of his ilk, he longed for a single world culture. Okay, now this is where it's going to get a little interesting. Aldous Huxley later came to America in the 30s and worked as a scriptwriter in Hollywood. His leftist credentials were epitomized by his comment that all men are equal is a proposition which at ordinary times no sane individual has ever given his assent. Lyndon LaRouche alleged that he also formed several cults devoted to Isis and other cult gods. Later in 1952, Huxley returned to America accompanied by his family's private physician, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was connected via Allen Dulles to the CIA's notorious MK-Ultra mind program. Huxley, along with Osmond and the University of Chicago's Robert Hutchins, the University of Chicago. Man, there was a book by Naomi Klein called Shock Doctrine, which lays out the evil that those people that place is responsible for. I may touch on some of that in some later readings. But yeah, the University of Chicago. Robert Hutchins participated in an LSD mescaline project funded by the Ford Foundation. The proposal would later turn into a 4-year experiment sponsored by the Rand Corporation, a front for the CIA. So let me skip down a little bit here, because it's talking about the Huxley using psychedelic drugs recreationally and drew into his inner circle noted writer Alan Watts and Dr. Gregory Bateson, ex-husband of Margaret Mead and early advocate of broader sexual morals. Watts would become a Zen Buddhist guru and founded the Pacifica Foundation, which would push cutting-edge rock music and leftist ideology throughout the 60s on their radio station at the Rockefellers' expense. The Pacifica Foundation. Now, if you know anything about them, you know they were, like they said, cutting-edge leftist ideology, but they were funded by the Rockefellers. Bateson, meanwhile, would experiment with LSD on mental patients at the Palo Alto, California VA hospital. One of his recruits from the hospital was Ken Kesey, future author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and later leader of the radical Merry Pranksters group. Kesey and his pranksters would go on to travel about the country, disseminating LSD to mostly unwary targets. In 1965, Kesey invited members of the nefarious Hells Angels to a gang party at his home. No, I read that wrong. In 1965, Kesey invited members of the nefarious Hells Angels gang to a party at his home, where he introduced them to LSD. How much of the LSD came from Allen Dulles' CIA supply is unknown. Former classified documents revealed to the public that Dulles had purchased over 100 million doses of LSD for the agency. Kesey's cult handed out so much of the LSD in San Francisco that it was probably directly responsible for transforming the Haight-Ashbury district into the epicenter of the flower power movement. Remember the song, "If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair." Bateson set up a free clinic in Haight-Ashbury, and one of the staffers was Roger Smith, who was the parole officer for street criminal Charles Manson. Another worker at the clinic was Dr. Peter Bourne, who would later become a special assistant on drug abuse to President Carter. Man, this is some crazy stuff, bro. Huxley was also associated with Dr. Louis Joyland West, notorious for killing an elephant by injecting it with LSD-25 under the auspices of the CIA's mind control MK Ultra program, an experiment in brainwashing. West was supposedly advised by Huxley to hypnotize his subjects prior to giving them LSD, providing the possibility of steering the experience in a particular direction. West would later be asked by the government to examine Jack Ruby, killer of Lee Harvey Oswald. West had a long background working in mind control arena. So he examined Jack Ruby. I wonder if that was before or after he shot Lee Harvey Oswald. Anyway, West had a long background working in mind control arena, and he allegedly treated Charles Manson, Sirhan, and the Branch Davidian cult leader David Koresh. Wow. Renegade former FBI official Ted Gunderson also claimed that West visited Timothy McVeigh in prison on multiple occasions. West was a director of the Cult Awareness Network, which has been associated with the CIA's MK-Ultra program. West was a protege of Dr. Ewan Cameron, who performed countless hideous brainwashing experiments on patients during the height of the Cold War, financed by the CIA. Now, he had to do that in Canada because they couldn't get away with it in the U.S. Yeah, man. This is also outlined in that book called Shock Doctrine. They talk about a case of a lady who was one of his subjects and how he went about his testings. He was also the first president of the World Psychiatric Association. That fact ought to make everyone question the overall credibility of the psychiatric field itself. Aldous Huxley, in a bizarre coincidence, died on November the 22nd, 1963, the same day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In a U.S. State Department-sponsored speech to the Tavistock Group in 1961, Huxley issued this bleak forecast. There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will, in fact, have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. Wow. Talk about having our liberties taken away while we're being distracted. That is happening every day. It began with the Patriot Act, and it is continuing. The pharmacological methods, and it seems to be the final evolution. The Tavistock Group in California shares the same name as England's Tavistock Institute, an outfit long associated with behavior modification and mind control. The Tavistock Institute sponsored a conference on the dialectics of liberation in 1967, and two of the American attendees were black radicals, Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis. And that's, wow. So, man, what can you say? A little bit more here. The intelligence ties of the 60s drug guru and Harvard professor Timothy Leary, whose credo, turn on, tune in, drop out, influenced untold numbers of impressionable young people, are well known. In his 1983 autobiography, Flashbacks, Leary credited CIA official Cord Meyer, who was allegedly responsible for overseeing funding to the so-called counterculture movement, with helping me to understand my political cultural role more clearly. Cord Meyer's wife, Mary Pinchot Meyer, also had an affair with JFK before being murdered in October 1964. Mary supposedly had a diary containing juicy government secrets, which was rumored to have been burned after her death by legendary CIA spy master James Jesus Angleton. Wow. Man, this is a great book. You definitely need to owe it to yourself to pick this up and check it out. I mean, this is just one section. This is at the beginning of the book. They they talk about the RFK assassination. Talks about how who else is in here? Shooting of George Wallace. House Select Committee on Assassinations. Reagan's years, the trickle-down treachery. I talk about Obama. There's the Reagan body count. Reagan had a body count. You always hear about the Clinton body count. Seems Reagan had a body count. Obama had a body count. Wow. W. Bush body count part 2. So, yeah, Hidden Histories by Donald Jeffries. You definitely should check this book out. It is well worth reading. It'll give you some context on the things that are happening now. You know, so many things are happening, and without the proper context, without the proper grasp of history, you don't understand it. But once you know history, you see it. You just see that, wow, it's almost like you can predict what's going to happen next. And it's not a prediction. It's that they're using the same playbook because it keeps working. They don't change. They don't change operation. People don't catch on, and they continue to march on. So the key to this to this whole thing is knowledge. Once you have knowledge, if you don't know there's a problem, there's no chance of you coming up with a solution to the problem. And one person cannot do it alone. I think that's being witnessed as all the people who thought Donald Trump was going to be the savior. You know, he's done some good things. You know, killing the TPP, the Paris Peace Accords. But then he turns around and he's draining the swamp. He's appointing the swamp creatures. You know, he's launching attacks on Syria, the same as Obama, because Assad is stupid enough they've gotten us to believe he's stupid enough to use chemical weapons on his own people when he's winning the war. Why would he use them on his own people? And why doesn't he ever use them on the terrorists or the people who he's fighting, who are the rebel forces? And, you know, it doesn't make sense. So Trump fell for that and they launched missiles, and they said, they missed, and he's playing 4D chess and this, that, and the other thing. So, but yeah, so as you can see, they don't change the playbook very often. So anyway, yeah, definitely pick this book up. Donald Jeffries, Hidden History. It's well worth the read. All right, peace out.